You step through gilded doors into the most magnificent palace in all of Christendom. The marble floors beneath your feet gleam like mirrors, reflecting the dancing flames of 1,000 candles that cast their golden light across walls adorned with priceless tapestries from the Orient. The soft rustle of silk gowns whispers promises of untold wealth and power as ladies of the court glide past like ethereal spirits, their jeweled fingers trailing across surfaces worth more than entire kingdoms. The air shimmers with an almost magical quality, thick with the weight of centuries, heavy with the perfume of roses and ambergris, alive with the electricity of absolute power. This is it, you think. This is the fairy tale made real, the storybook come to life. You breathe deeply, ready to fill your lungs with the essence of royal magnificence, and then it hits you. That smell. Sweet, cloying perfume, desperately trying to mask something far more human. Your eyes begin to water slightly as the reality behind the fantasy seeps into your consciousness like poison through silk. This is not the sanitized fairy tale of Disney movies or romantic period dramas. This is the authentic world of medieval and Renaissance royalty, where beneath those jeweled crowns and magnificent robes lurked hygiene practices that would make a modern person double over and retch. The woman approaching you in layers of golden brocade, her sleeves dripping with pearls the size of robin's eggs, might rule an empire that spans continents, but she hasn't properly bathed in months. The gentleman bowing before her with such exquisite courtly grace controls the fate of nations, commands armies that could level cities, yet his unwashed body harbours enough lice to populate a small village. The lady-in-waiting averting her eyes so demurely as trying not to breathe through her nose because the queen's breath could fell a horse at 20 paces. Welcome to the real royal court, where power was absolute but soap was optional, where divine right meant never having to say you're sorry about your body odour, and where the phrase cleanliness is next to godliness was considered not just wrong but dangerously heretical. You've just stepped into a world where the most powerful women on earth lived in conditions of personal filth that would horrify a modern homeless shelter, where beauty routines literally poisoned the beautiful, and where the pursuit of royal elegance created walking monuments to human suffering that staggers the imagination. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. 1. The monthly bath ritual. It's 1580, and you're a servant in Queen Elizabeth I's court. Dawn breaks over Greenwich Palace as you receive the most dreaded assignment in all of England, preparing Her Majesty's monthly bath. Yes, monthly. The most powerful woman in the known world, with coffers that could buy nations, barely bathed once a month. Medical experts considered even this frequency dangerously excessive. 20 servants haul bucket after bucket of water from kitchens where fires have burned since midnight. The wooden tub sits like a medieval torture device, lined with finest linen to prevent splinters piercing royal flesh. But here's where true horror begins. Elizabeth layered Venetian ceruse, a lead-based skin whitener, daily without removing previous applications. As you help the Queen disrobe, the magnitude becomes clear. Her face is a patchwork of cracked, flaking white paint built up into actual layers, geological strata of vanity and poison. When she steps into water, it immediately turns murky as months of accumulated cosmetics, sweat and grime dissolve away. The lead-based makeup peels off in sheets like paint flaking from old buildings. The smell rising from that tub defied description, metallic tang of lead mixed with vinegar-based cosmetics, layered over months-old human secretions, all warming to create an olfactory assault that could drop a grown man. You must stand attending your queen while your stomach churns and eyes water, watching dead skin come away in grey flakes mixed with white lead residue and brown stains of accumulated grime. Elizabeth I, like nearly all nobles and royals on the continent, used Venetian ceruse, a mixture of vinegar, water, and white lead. But the horror wasn't thickness, it was consistency and accumulation. Each morning brought fresh poison, painted over old poison, creating an ever-thickening mask of toxicity. Marie Antoinette turned her monthly baths into theatrical performances. The French queen would bathe in a full-length linen gown, surrounded by servants and courtiers, sometimes eating breakfast while sitting in the tub. Picture the Queen of France soaking in her own filth, while nobles made polite conversation and she delicately nibbled pastries. The psychological impact was devastating. These women commanded armies while their skin crawled with constant itching, not normal unwashed skin, but deep, maddening sensations of accumulated toxins working through their pores. Elizabeth's scalp was a nightmare of oils, dead skin, and hairstyling detritus. The lead caused hair loss, requiring elaborate wigs that made problems worse. Most heartbreaking was how these queens maintained dignity while marinating in filth. They held court while fighting urges to scratch, made life and death decisions through constant physical discomfort, and presented themselves as divine representatives while slowly poisoning themselves in pursuit of impossible beauty standards. 2. The lead face paint nightmare. Step closer to Elizabeth I and her private chambers, and true horror becomes clear. Her face painted white as snow isn't just makeup, it's a death mask applied fresh each morning over yesterday's layer, and the day before that, and weeks before that. The Queen's morning routine was a ritual of slow suicide. She awakened with yesterday's lead paint, cracked and flaking like dried mud. Ladies-in-waiting approached with fresh mixture of vinegar, water, and white lead, but they didn't wash off old layers first. Water and washing were considered dangerous. Instead, they painted fresh poison over old, creating an ever-thickening mask. Elizabeth I, like nearly all nobles and royals on the continent, used Venetian ceruse, a mixture of vinegar, water, and white lead. The lead seeped through skin day after day, year after year, causing mood swings, memory problems, and erratic behavior. Courtiers noted how her temper became volatile, how she forgot conversations mid-sentence. They attributed it to ruling pressures, never realizing their queen was poisoning herself for pale perfection. The smell alone overwhelmed senses. Lead has a distinctive metallic odor, mixed with vinegar base and accumulated oils underneath. Close conversation with the queen required breathing through one's mouth to avoid gagging. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Lead poisoning causes paranoia, memory loss, and sudden rages that courtiers witnessed but couldn't understand. Physical effects created a vicious cycle. Lead caused hair loss, requiring increasingly elaborate wigs. It grayed and puckered skin, demanding thicker applications to hide damage. It rotted teeth and created breath so foul that courtiers learned to stand at specific distances during audiences. The very solution to each problem created worse problems, trapping these women in cycles of escalating toxicity. This wasn't vanity, it was addiction. The lead provided a temporary sense of perfection, a ghostly pallor that represented divine purity in an age obsessed with pale skin. But like any addiction, tolerance built up. What started as light applications became thick masks as skin became increasingly damaged and discolored. The queens became prisoners of their own pursuit of beauty, slowly dying for an impossible standard that killed them from outside in. 3. The Great Lice Epidemic. The 17th century British King James I was said to never bathe, causing the rooms he frequented to be filled with lice. But this wasn't just a personal problem, it was a palace-wide infestation that turned the highest levels of government into a crawling nightmare where power meetings became exercises in not scratching. Lady Anne Clifford wrote that when visiting the king's chambers, she and her family were all lousy by sitting in the chamber of Sir Thomas Erskine. Imagine that moment, you're a high-ranking noble, dressed in finest silks and jewels, sitting for an audience with the king. Within minutes, you feel the first telltale tickling. Then another. Soon your entire body crawls with parasites that have migrated from furniture, wall hangings, even the king himself. The lice weren't just annoyance, they were disease vectors. Typhus, spread by body lice, killed more soldiers than war itself. These tiny creatures, gorged on royal blood, carried plague from person to person throughout society's highest levels. Every handshake, every bow, every intimate conversation became potential transmission of deadly disease. James the Braided wore the same clothes for months, even sleeping in them. His hat remained on his head 7 days a week until it literally fell apart. Every fibre became a breeding ground for parasites. The royal chambers must have looked like horror movie sets, dark corners thick with insects, furniture that literally moved with writhing masses of lice, and constant scratching echoing through halls of power. The psychological torture was immense. Imagine trying to conduct diplomatic negotiations while your entire body itches. Picture attempting to maintain royal dignity while parasites crawl across your scalp during state ceremonies. These weren't just uncomfortable nobles, they were human beings driven to near madness by constant assault of creatures feeding on their blood. Court ceremonies became grotesque theatre, where everyone participated in collective denial. Nobles would stand in elaborate formation, bowing and curtsying with perfect protocol, while frantically trying not to scratch. The rustling of silk gowns mixed with barely audible sounds of fingernails against fabric, as courtiers fought losing battles against armies of insects. Women's elaborate hairstyles became perfect breeding grounds. Hair was combed, curled, greased with a mix of bear or ox fat, and then dusted with powder. And what with not bathing and not having particularly good hygiene, fleas were pretty much on every head, so some fashionable women carried long thin sticks with claws for scratching their heads with. Picture the daily reality. Towering hair constructions held together with animal fat, providing warm, moist environments perfect for insect reproduction. The bear and ox fat attracted every parasite within miles, creating writhing ecosystems that lived permanently in royal coiffures. Women carried ornate scratching sticks, elegant ivory or silver implements, designed specifically to reach through hairstyles to provide temporary relief. But the true horror was how this became normalized. Court etiquette developed around the constant presence of parasites. There were proper ways to scratch, appropriate times to use scratching implements, and elaborate protocols for handling the reality that everyone was constantly infested. The most powerful people on Earth lived like walking insect colonies, maintaining composure while slowly being consumed alive. 4. The Venetian Ceres addiction. The tragedy of royal beauty standards reached its peak with widespread use of Venetian ceruse across European courts. This wasn't makeup, it was slow-acting poison that transformed queens into walking zombies, their minds increasingly addled as their beauty routine literally killed them from outside in. The mixture was deceptively simple: white bead ground into powder, mixed with vinegar to create paste that dried to ghostly white finish. But the application process revealed true horror. Noble women didn't wear this for special occasions. They wore it every single day, often reapplying over unwashed layers built up over weeks. Picture a 16th century queen's morning routine. She awakens with yesterday's face cracked and peeling. Ladies in waiting approach with brushes and familiar white paste. They don't cleanse first. Water was dangerous. Instead, they smooth fresh poison over old, creating masks that grew heavier with each passing day, eventually reaching weights that caused neck strain and headaches. The psychological effects were devastating. Lead poisoning causes mood swings, paranoia, and memory loss. Courtiers noted how their queens became increasingly erratic, prone to sudden rages or inexplicable sadness. They attributed changes to ruling stresses, never realizing their sovereigns were slowly losing minds to vanity. Physical effects created horror shows. Lead caused hair loss, so women wore increasingly elaborate wigs that further damaged scalps. It grayed and puckered skin, requiring ever thicker applications to hide damage. Most grotesquely, it rotted teeth and caused breath, so foul that courtiers learned specific distances for audiences, close enough to hear whispered commands, far enough to avoid retching. The addiction cycle was vicious. Each application provided temporary sense of perfection, ghostly pallor representing divine purity. But tolerance built up as skin became damaged and discolored. What started as light dusting became thick masks as women desperately tried to hide increasing toxicity damage. They became prisoners of their own beauty pursuit, slowly dying for impossible standards. Court physicians recognized the danger but couldn't overcome fashion demands. Medical texts from the period warn against lead-based cosmetics, describing symptoms we now recognize as heavy metal poisoning. But vanity trumped survival. Queens would rather die beautiful than live naturally. The final stages were horrifying. Women in advanced lead poisoning developed distinctive grey pallor that no amount of makeup could hide. Their hair fell out in clumps, their teeth turned black and fell out, and their breath became so foul that even heavily perfumed handkerchiefs couldn't mask the stench. Yet they continued applying fresh poison each morning, trapped in cycles of escalating toxicity that inevitably ended in slow, agonizing death. Most tragic was how these women maintained royal dignity while essentially decomposing alive. They held audiences while their faces literally cracked and flaked, signed death warrants while suffering from lead-induced paranoia, and ruled nations while slowly losing cognitive function to vanity-driven poisoning. 5. The perfume mask. In the fetid atmosphere of unwashed royal courts, perfume wasn't luxury, it was desperate chemical warfare against the stench of human decay. The truly horrifying part wasn't what they wore, but what they were desperately trying to hide beneath layers of increasingly potent fragrances. At times, over 10,000 royals, aristocrats, government officials, servants, and military officers lived in Versailles and its surrounding lodgings. Women pulled up their skirts up to pee where they stood, while some men urinated off the balustrade in the middle of the royal chapel. The smell was so overwhelming that courtiers developed entire cultures around masking it with increasingly desperate measures. Queens and noble ladies carried sachets of scent, pressed to their noses at all times, not fashion accessories, but survival equipment. They wore perfumed gloves that left trails of fragrance marking their passage through corridors. Their hair was doused with oils so strong they could be detected from across rooms. But beneath this aromatic armor lurked brutal reality of unwashed bodies, rotting teeth, and clothes that hadn't been cleaned in months. Queen Elizabeth I was keenly aware of the importance of her public image, and the atmosphere at her court was infused with the scents of flowers, musk, and amber. But this wasn't luxury, it was survival. The alternative was having courtiers pass out from stench during important state meetings. The perfume itself often became part of the problem. Applied over unwashed skin, it mixed with body oils and sweat to create new, even more nauseating odors. Imagine sickly sweet rose oil mixed with months-old perspiration, or cloying amber trying to mask metallic tang of infected wounds. The resulting cocktails were often worse than original problems they attempted to solve. Court perfumers became military strategists in olfactory warfare. They developed increasingly potent concoctions designed to overpower human stench rather than complement natural scents. Recipes called for massive quantities of musk, ambergris, and civet, animal secretions so powerful they could be smelled from considerable distances. These weren't delicate fragrances, but olfactory sledgehammers designed to bludgeon noses into submission. The psychological impact was profound. Nobles became paranoid about their own scents, constantly checking and reapplying perfumes throughout the day. They developed elaborate codes around fragrance. Certain scents signaled political alliances, others indicated availability for romantic liaisons, still others warned of disease or disfavor. Most disturbing was how this created class hierarchies based on smell. The ability to afford increasingly potent perfumes became marker of social status. Nobles who couldn't afford strongest fragrances found themselves literally marginalized, pushed to edges of gatherings where their inferior scent armor left them vulnerable to social exile. Women's clothing became delivery systems for fragrance rather than mere fashion. Gowns were designed with hidden sachets and perfume chambers. Sleeves contained reservoirs of scented oils that released fragrance with each gesture. Jewelry was hollowed out to contain perfumed wax that melted slowly from body heat, providing continuous aromatic coverage. But perhaps most tragic was how this desperate masking prevented any real solutions. Instead of addressing hygiene problems, courts simply escalated perfume arms races. Each season brought stronger fragrances designed to overpower previous year's stench, creating cycles of escalating olfactory assault that made original problems worse while providing only temporary relief. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. Palace air became thick, almost unbreathable soup of competing fragrances mixed with underlying human decay. Visitors frequently reported headaches, nausea, and respiratory problems from exposure to concentrated perfume environments. Yet courtiers preferred these symptoms to experiencing unmasked reality of royal hygiene. 6. The toilet attendant Here's something that will make your skin crawl and challenge everything you thought you knew about power, dignity, and human degradation. In medieval England, the man who attended to the king's personal hygiene was considered a man of the highest esteem, wielding influence that senators and generals could only dream of. If you got extremely lucky, and I use that term with the deepest irony, the King of England would appoint you as groom of the king's close stool. Your job was to carry around his portable toilet box and clean him afterwards. But this wasn't just about cleaning up after royal bathroom visits. This was about the most intimate, degrading, and yet politically powerful position in the entire kingdom. The groom of the close stool would have to physically handle the king's waste, clean his unwashed posterior with rough cloth or bare hands, and tend to his most private bodily functions while maintaining the dignity and ceremony required by court protocol. They became human toilet paper for men who believed they were appointed by God himself. Picture the daily reality of this position during the reign of a king who rarely bathed, whose diet consisted of massive quantities of meat that rotted in his gut, and whose body was riddled with infections, open sores and diseases that would make a modern doctor recoil in horror. You wake each morning knowing that within hours you'll be kneeling behind the most powerful man in England, cleaning excrement from body parts that haven't seen soap in months, breathing air thick with the stench of royal bowel movements mixed with infected wounds and unwashed flesh. The groom of the stool was privy to the king's confidence and would often learn many court secrets. The groom of the stool eventually rose to a position of considerable influence, participating in policy-making at the highest levels. There was no stigma associated with his menial duties, quite the opposite. These men became some of the most politically powerful individuals in the kingdom, precisely because they had access to the king during his most vulnerable and private moments. Imagine the psychological profile required for this position. You're handling the literal waste of an unwashed monarch who might not have bathed in months, whose clothes haven't been changed in weeks, whose body is riddled with infections and suppurating sores. The smell alone would have been overwhelming, a combination of fecal matter, infected wounds, unwashed flesh, rancid clothing, and whatever perfumes were being used to mask the overall horror. Yet you must maintain perfect composure, speak when spoken to, offer counsel when asked, and never ever show revulsion or disgust. But here's where it gets truly psychologically disturbing. These men developed genuine emotional bonds with the kings they served. They knew when the monarch was ill before anyone else, understood his physical weaknesses, observed his bodily functions with clinical precision, and used this intimate knowledge to gain political advantage. They became human confessionals for royal bodies that were falling apart, repositories for the most degrading aspects of absolute power. The king would often conduct business while using his close stool, making decisions that affected millions of lives while his groom knelt behind him with cleaning cloths. Treaties were signed, wars were declared, and executions were ordered in rooms reeking of royal excrement. The most important conversations in English history took place while one man wiped another's unwashed backside. Consider the power dynamics at play. The king, despite his absolute authority, was completely vulnerable and dependent during these moments. The groom literally held the king's physical comfort and dignity in his hands. This intimate knowledge of royal bodily functions became a form of political currency that could be used to influence policy, gain access to restricted information, and build alliances with other powerful court figures. The position often passed from father to son, creating dynasties of royal toilet attendants who accumulated wealth, property, and political influence across generations. These families knew the most intimate secrets of English royalty, not just political secrets, but physical ones. They knew which kings suffered from chronic diarrhea, which ones had hemorrhoids that bled constantly, which ones screamed in pain during bowel movements due to untreated medical conditions. Most disturbing of all was how this arrangement normalized the complete degradation of human dignity in service to power. Young men competed for the honor of cleaning royal waste because it represented the pinnacle of court success. Parents prayed their sons would be chosen for this privilege. The entire social structure was so twisted that handling another man's excrement became a mark of distinction rather than degradation. The grooms developed specialized techniques for their work, using different cloths for different purposes, learning to predict the king's bodily rhythms, understanding which foods cause which types of digestive distress. They became medical experts by necessity, often the first to notice signs of illness or disease. Their observations could influence royal diet, schedule important meetings around digestive patterns, and even affect succession planning if the king's health was failing. The psychological toll on these men must have been enormous, though it's never discussed in historical accounts. They spent their lives in service to the most degrading aspects of human existence, yet were expected to maintain dignity, discretion, and loyalty. They knew more about their king's bodies than wives or physicians, yet could never speak of what they witnessed. They held immense political power derived from the most powerless position imaginable, kneeling in human waste, while the fate of nations was decided above their heads. 7. The Spanish Inquisition against soap. The story of Queen Isabella of Castile represents perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of royal hygiene, when the deliberate embrace of filth became a twisted form of religious devotion that destroyed entire civilizations and turned cleanliness into a capital offense punishable by burning alive. In Spain, the Christian doctrine saw bathing to be a corrupt practice that could only lead to nakedness. It was considered a form of hedonism and something unreligious. But this wasn't just personal preference, it became official state policy that turned hygiene into heresy and made soap a tool of the devil. While modern historians have largely debunked the extreme claims about Isabella bathing only twice in her lifetime, the documented persecution of hygiene practices is real, terrifying, and represents one of history's most systematic attacks on basic human health. Picture the psychological architecture of this horror. You're living in 15th century Spain, where the most powerful woman in the kingdom has declared that washing your body is an act of rebellion against God himself. The church, backed by royal authority, proclaims that clean skin is evidence of moral corruption, that the removal of dirt and grime somehow removes divine grace as well. Priests deliver sermons explaining how suffering through filth brings you closer to Christ's suffering on the cross. After the conquest of Granada by the Christians, the Muslims of Spain not only had to give up their religion to survive the Inquisition, they also had to give up bathing. Isabella and Ferdinand ordered the Muslim baths to be destroyed and bathing was strictly forbidden. This wasn't just about religious conversion. It was about the systematic destruction of an entire culture's approach to human dignity and health. Imagine the psychological torture of this policy. You're a Muslim living under Christian rule, and suddenly your daily ablutions, a cornerstone of your faith and personal hygiene, become a capital offense. Inquisitors would inspect homes for signs of bathing. Being caught with soap, clean clothes, or bathing facilities could result in being burned alive as a heretic. The very act of washing your face became evidence of secret Islamic practice that could doom your entire family. The Inquisition developed sophisticated methods for detecting bathing. They looked for homes that used too much water, investigated families whose clothing appeared too clean, and questioned neighbors about suspicious washing activities. Children were encouraged to inform on parents who bathed regularly. Servants were interrogated about their master's hygiene habits. The entire social structure became a surveillance network designed to detect and punish cleanliness. When Columbus mentioned about the daily bathing habits of the natives of the Bahamas and the Caribbeans, Isabella was horrified and commanded her new subjects to stop this blasphemous bathing practice at once. The clean, healthy indigenous people of the Americas were forced to abandon their hygiene practices in favor of European filth, literally spreading disease and death in the name of Christian purity. Picture that moment of first contact. Spanish conquistadors, unwashed for months and riddled with diseases unknown in the Americas, encounter indigenous peoples whose daily bathing rituals had kept them healthy for centuries. Instead of learning from these superior hygiene practices, the Spanish declared them satanic and systematically destroyed the infrastructure that supported cleanliness in the New World. The psychological impact on indigenous populations was devastating. They watched European diseases decimate their populations while being forbidden to practice the cleanliness rituals that had protected them for generations. Parents watched children die from diseases that could have been prevented by simple washing, while Spanish priests explained that suffering through filth was God's will. The Spanish established purity of blood laws that extended to hygiene practices. Families had to prove not only Christian ancestry, but also Christian uncleanliness. Genealogical records included information about bathing habits across generations. Being descended from people who bathed regularly could disqualify you from certain positions or social ranks. Cleanliness became racial evidence that could be used to justify persecution, enslavement, or execution. Most horrifically, the Spanish exported this anti-hygiene ideology across their empire. From the Philippines to Mexico, from Peru to the Caribbean, colonial administrators systematically destroyed local bathing practices and replaced them with European filth. Ancient aqueducts were abandoned, public baths were demolished, and traditional cleansing rituals were banned under penalty of death. The medical consequences were catastrophic. Diseases that had been controlled through traditional hygiene practices exploded across Spanish territories. Typhus, dysentery, and skin infections became endemic in populations that had previously been healthy. The Spanish inadvertently created biological warfare on a massive scale, using filth as a weapon against their own subjects. The psychological framework that supported this horror was deeply embedded in Christian theology of the time. Cleanliness was associated with vanity, which was sinful. Suffering through physical discomfort was seen as spiritual purification. The more one suffered in the flesh, the more one was purified in spirit. This created a perverse incentive structure where deliberately making yourself sick became evidence of religious devotion. Spanish royal courts became showcases for competitive suffering. Nobles competed to see who could go longest without bathing, who could endure the most extreme body odor, who could develop the most impressive array of skin diseases and parasitic infections. What had started as religious policy became social competition based on deliberate self-harm. The long-term consequences extended far beyond Spain itself. European colonization became synonymous with the destruction of hygiene infrastructure worldwide. Traditional knowledge about medicinal bathing, therapeutic washing, and preventive cleanliness was systematically suppressed and lost. Entire civilizations that had developed sophisticated understanding of hygiene were forced to abandon practices that had kept them healthy for millennia. Perhaps most tragically, this represented one of history's greatest reversals of human progress. While Islamic civilization, Asian cultures, and indigenous peoples worldwide had developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to hygiene and public health, European Christianity was moving in the opposite direction, creating ideological frameworks that turned cleanliness into sin and suffering into virtue. 8. The milk bath deception. Picture this scene of grotesque false charity that reveals the twisted psychology of royal privilege. Countess Platen of Hanover lies submerged in a bathtub filled with warm milk, her body racked with what historical records describe as a distressing malady, almost certainly syphilis or another venereal disease that was ravaging the European nobility like a plague of divine retribution for their sexual excesses. But this isn't a scene of luxury or indulgence. This is a woman so diseased that her skin weeps with open sores, her body consumed by infection that has likely eaten away portions of her nose and left her breath reeking of rotting flesh. The milk bath isn't beauty treatment. It's a desperate attempt to soothe skin that feels like it's burning from the inside out, to provide temporary relief from the constant agony of advanced venereal disease. While suffering from a distressing malady, Countess Platen Hanover bathed in milk and then generously donated the contaminated milk to the poor. The psychological cruelty of this act is staggering and reveals a level of callous disregard for human life that defies modern comprehension. Here was a woman so diseased that her very presence could infect others, and she chose to soak in milk, then pass that same contaminated liquid to hungry peasants as an act of supposed Christian charity. Imagine being a poor family receiving this generous donation. You're starving, your children are malnourished, winter is approaching, and food is scarce. Then arrives a servant from the noble household bearing what appears to be a gift from heaven. Fresh milk that could mean the difference between life and death for your family. You accept it gratefully, perhaps even saying prayers of thanksgiving for the Countess's generosity. You have no way of knowing that this milk has been contaminated with the bodily fluids of a woman dying from venereal disease. You can't see the microscopic organisms that now swim in the liquid you're about to feed your children. You don't understand that this charity is actually a vector for spreading infection from the palace to the poorest quarters of the city, that your benefactor's generosity is actually a death sentence disguised as kindness. The Countess herself likely believed she was performing a Christian duty. In her diseased mind, clouded by the psychological effects of advanced syphilis, she was sharing her abundance with those in need. The fact that her abundance was literally contaminated with her own infected bodily fluids seemed irrelevant to the moral calculus of the time. She had more than she needed, the poor had less than they required, therefore sharing was virtuous regardless of the consequences. This reveals the profound psychological disconnect between nobility and common humanity that characterized royal courts. The Countess lived in a world where her comfort and convenience were paramount, where her physical needs took precedence over the lives of hundreds of poor families. The possibility that her bathing habits might kill innocent people simply didn't register as morally relevant. They were poor, therefore their lives had minimal value compared to her temporary relief from disease. But this wasn't an isolated incident of individual cruelty. This represented a systemic problem that plagued royal courts across Europe, the casual transmission of disease from wealthy, infected nobles to the populations they governed. Similar acts of generosity spread death throughout the continent. Food prepared by diseased royal cooks, clothing passed down from infected nobles, communion wine shared by clergy suffering from various maladies, even sexual contact between diseased nobility and servants who couldn't refuse royal advances. The royal courts became inadvertent biological warfare centers, spreading disease through every aspect of their interaction with common people. Wedding celebrations where diseased nobles shared food and drink with hundreds of guests. Religious ceremonies where infected priests handled communion elements touched by countless lips. Public appearances where diseased royalty showered crowds with blessed objects that carried infection from palace to countryside. The psychological impact on recipients of such charity was devastating when they discovered the truth. Families who had praised the Countess's generosity while their children died from diseases contracted through her milk faced a horrible realization their benefactor had killed their loved ones through kindness. The very act they had celebrated as evidence of noble virtue was actually murder disguised as charity. Most disturbing was how this pattern repeated across generations without anyone learning from the consequences. Court records show similar incidents involving other nobles who donated contaminated food, infected clothing, and diseased livestock to poor communities. The nobility seemed incapable of understanding that their diseases could affect others, or perhaps they simply didn't care enough about common people to consider the consequences of their actions. The medical ignorance of the time contributed to these horrors, but willful blindness played an equally important role. Some court physicians understood disease transmission well enough to advise against such practices, but their warnings were ignored when they conflicted with noble convenience or vanity. The desire to appear charitable outweighed concerns about public health, even when the consequences were mass death among vulnerable populations. This represented the ultimate corruption of Christian charity, turning acts of giving into instruments of death, transforming virtuous impulses into vectors for biological warfare. The Countess probably died believing she had lived a generous charitable life, never understanding that her kindness had killed more people than deliberate cruelty could have accomplished. 9. The hair horror. The elaborate hairstyles of royal women weren't just fashion statements. They were portable ecosystems of filth, decay, and living parasites that would make a modern person vomit on sight and run screaming from any room where such horrors existed. These towering monuments to vanity were actually biological disasters that transformed human heads into breeding grounds for creatures that fed on royal flesh while their hosts maintained perfect composure in public. Hair was combed, curled, greased with a mix of bear or ox fat, nice not, and then dusted with powder. And what with not bathing and not having particularly good hygiene, fleas were pretty much on every head, so some fashionable women carried long thin sticks with claws for scratching their heads with. But this barely scratches the surface of the true horror that was royal hair care in the medieval and Renaissance periods. Picture the daily routine of constructing these towering monuments to vanity. The process began before dawn with servants who had drawn the short straw for hair duty. The Queen's natural hair, what remained of it after months of chemical damage and parasite infestation, would first be coated with rendered animal fat that had been prepared in palace kitchens from bear or ox carcasses. This wasn't refined, processed fat like modern cosmetic ingredients, but thick, rancid grease that carried the smell and texture of rotting meat. The stench alone would have been overwhelming. Fresh animal fat has a distinctive, nauseating odor that becomes exponentially worse as it ages and turns rancid. Mixed with unwashed human hair that hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks or months, seasoned with the accumulated detritus of previous styling sessions, and warmed by body heat, this created an olfactory assault that could drop a grown person to their knees. But the smell was just the beginning. This grease attracted every insect within miles, creating a writhing ecosystem that lived permanently in the queen's coiffure. Fleas, lice, ticks, and various flying insects were drawn to the warm, moist environment like moths to flame. They didn't just visit, they moved in permanently, establishing breeding colonies that turned royal heads into living insect cities. The insects weren't just passengers, they were active participants in a biological horror show that played out on the queen's scalp every moment of every day. Fleas would lay eggs in the grease that served as both food source and nursery for their offspring. Lice would burrow into accumulated layers of fat and dead skin, creating tunnels and chambers where they could reproduce in safety. The queen's head became a maternity ward for parasites that fed on her blood while she slept, conducted state business, and attended religious ceremonies. The powder applied on top of this biological stew served multiple purposes, none of them hygienic. It was supposed to absorb excess grease and provide fashionable coloring, blue, pink, gold, or traditional white. But it quickly mixed with the animal fat, insect waste, and accumulated grime to create a paste-like substance that hardened into a helmet of filth that couldn't be removed without literally cutting it away from the scalp. Women's hair was often left in these elaborate styles for weeks at a time because the construction process was so labor-intensive and expensive. During this period, the biological ecosystem continued to evolve and expand. Dead insects would accumulate in layers, providing food for scavenger insects that fed on decomposing matter. The queen's hairstyle became a complete food chain with predators, prey, and decomposers all living in the same cramped environment. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the physical horror. These women had to maintain perfect composure while their scalps crawled with vermin that never stopped moving, eating, reproducing, and dying. They carried special scratching sticks, essentially long ivory or silver picks decorated with jewels to match their gowns, that they could discreetly insert into their hairstyles to provide temporary relief from the constant itching and crawling sensations. Imagine trying to conduct a diplomatic meeting while parasites literally ate away at your scalp. Picture attempting to maintain royal dignity during religious ceremonies while insects crawled across your forehead and down your neck. These women had to smile, nod, and speak coherently while fighting the constant urge to tear their elaborate hairstyles apart and scratch until they drew blood. The structures themselves could take 6 to 8 hours to construct and were often left in place for 2 to 3 weeks. During this time, the hair underneath would mat and tangle, creating an even more perfect breeding ground for insects and bacteria. Some women developed permanent bald patches, where the weight and constant insect activity had destroyed their natural hair completely. Others suffered from chronic scalp infections that created open wounds that attracted even more parasites. The smell emanating from these hairstyles was so overwhelming that courtiers developed elaborate codes for positioning themselves during audiences. Everyone knew to stand upwind of the queen when possible, to breathe through their mouths during close conversations, and to carry perfumed handkerchiefs that could be discreetly pressed to their noses when the stench became unbearable. But perhaps most disturbing was how this horror became normalized and even celebrated as the height of fashion and sophistication. The more elaborate your hairstyle, the more insects it could support, the stronger it smelled, the higher your social status. Women competed to see who could construct the most towering, complex, parasite-infested hair sculptures. What should have been recognized as a public health crisis became a fashion competition, where the prize was the most disgusting head of hair in the kingdom. The construction of these hairstyles required teams of servants who risked their own health to serve royal vanity. Hairstylists worked in shifts because prolonged exposure to the stench and insect activity could cause nausea, respiratory problems, and parasitic infections. They developed specialized tools for working around living insects, techniques for avoiding the worst concentrations of vermin, and strategies for completing their work as quickly as possible to minimize exposure. Most tragically, these women often understood exactly what they were doing to themselves but felt powerless to change because the social pressure was so intense. Court records include private letters where noble ladies expressed disgust with their own hair care routines, described the constant itching and discomfort, and longed for simpler, cleaner approaches to beauty. But they were trapped by social expectations that valued appearance over health, status over comfort, and fashion over basic human dignity. 10. The Versailles Catastrophe. The ultimate horror story of royal hygiene comes from Louis XIV's Versailles, where the Sun King's decision to centralize his court created perhaps the most unsanitary environment in European history, a place so foul that it makes modern sewage treatment plants seem like gardens of Eden. At times, over 10,000 royals, aristocrats, government officials, servants and military officers lived in Versailles and its surrounding lodgings, creating a concentration of human waste, disease, and biological decay that defied every natural law of sanitation and transformed the most beautiful palace in the world into a gilded cesspit of unimaginable proportions. Despite its reputation for magnificence, life at Versailles, for both royals and servants, was no cleaner than the slum-like conditions in many European cities at the time. Women pulled up their skirts up to pee where they stood, while some men urinated off the balustrade in the middle of the royal chapel. This wasn't occasional emergency relief. This was the normal, accepted method of handling bodily functions in a palace that housed more people than most cities, but had virtually no functional toilet facilities. Picture walking through the most famous palace in the world during the height of its glory, golden walls gleaming in candlelight, priceless artwork adorning every surface, mirrors reflecting infinite images of luxury and power, but your feet splash through puddles of urine that soak into imported carpets worth fortunes. The constant sound of trickling liquid echoes through corridors as courtiers relieve themselves wherever they happen to be standing. The smell of human waste mingles with expensive perfumes to create an olfactory nightmare that burns your nostrils and makes your eyes water. According to historian Tony Sporforth, Marie Antoinette was once hit by human waste being thrown out the window as she walked through an interior courtyard. Imagine that moment, the Queen of France, dressed in silks and jewels worth more than entire provinces, walking through her own palace when human excrement literally falls from the sky onto her elaborate gown. This wasn't a freak accident. This was Tuesday at Versailles, where throwing waste out windows was standard practice because there was nowhere else for it to go. The infrastructure simply couldn't handle the human load that the Sun King's ego had created. Louis XIV had moved his entire court to Versailles permanently, concentrating more people in one location than the building had ever been designed to support. The heavily trafficked latrines often leaked into the bedrooms below them, while blockages and corrosion in the palace's iron and lead pipes were known to occasionally poison everything in Marie Antoinette's kitchen. Imagine being Queen of France and having sewage leak into your food preparation areas. Picture trying to maintain royal dignity while human waste literally drips from the ceiling onto your dining table during state banquets. The psychological stress of living in such conditions while maintaining the fiction that this was the height of civilization and refinement must have been overwhelming for everyone involved. Not even the rooms of the royal children were safe, writes Sporforth. The future kings and queens of France were raised in an environment that was essentially a beautiful cesspit, where excrement was as common as silk and jewels. Children who would one day rule empires learned to walk by avoiding puddles of human waste in palace corridors. They played games while breathing air thick with the stench of 10,000 people's bodily functions. The smell throughout the palace must have been indescribable. With 10,000 people producing waste every day and only primitive sewage systems that frequently backed up or overflowed, the air would have been thick with the stench of human excrement, unwashed bodies, rotting food, infected wounds, and whatever perfumes people used to try to mask the horror. Breathing became an act of willpower that required constant mental preparation. But the psychological horror went deeper than just physical discomfort. This was supposed to be the center of civilization, the pinnacle of human achievement, the earthly representation of divine order. Ambassadors came from across the world to witness French sophistication and refinement. Instead, they found themselves wading through human waste while trying to conduct diplomatic negotiations with people who hadn't bathed in months and whose breath could knock them unconscious. The courtiers developed elaborate coping mechanisms that reveal the depths of their psychological adaptation to horror. They learned to identify the safest areas of the palace where waste accumulation was minimal. They developed codes for warning each other about fresh deposits of excrement. They mastered techniques for walking through corridors without stepping in human waste, strategies for positioning themselves during ceremonies to avoid the worst smells, and methods for breathing that minimized their exposure to toxic air. Court etiquette evolved to accommodate the reality of living in a human cesspit. There were proper ways to relieve yourself during royal audiences, acceptable locations for urination during religious ceremonies, and elaborate protocols for dealing with situations where waste disposal conflicted with court ceremony. The most sophisticated social system in European history adapted itself to function within conditions that would have horrified medieval peasants. The women's elaborate gowns became mobile waste management systems. The multiple layers of skirts and petticoats were designed partly to hide the fact that ladies were urinating where they stood. The heavy fabrics absorbed liquids and carried waste away from the immediate area, distributing it throughout the palace as women moved through their daily routines. Fashion became a form of sewage distribution that spread biological contamination wherever court ladies walked. Most disturbing was how children born and raised in this environment came to see it as normal. Young nobles who spent their entire lives at Versailles developed psychological frameworks that normalized living in human waste. They literally didn't understand that there were alternatives to these conditions because they had never experienced anything else. When they eventually left Versailles for other locations, many experienced culture shock at encountering basic sanitation. The health consequences were catastrophic and predictable. Diseases that spread through fecal contamination became endemic at Versailles. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera moved through the court in waves that killed nobles and servants alike. But instead of addressing the underlying sanitation problems, court physicians blamed the diseases on bad air, moral corruption, or divine punishment for various sins. The palace staff faced impossible working conditions that would qualify as cruel and unusual punishment by any modern standard. Servants whose job was cleaning had to work in environments so toxic that many developed permanent respiratory problems. They were expected to maintain palace splendor while surrounded by biological hazards that could kill them. Many developed chronic illnesses from constant exposure to human waste, but they couldn't quit because royal service was often their only option for survival. Perhaps most tragic was how this nightmare was exported as a model for royal courts across Europe. Other monarchs visited Versailles and returned home trying to recreate its magnificence without understanding that they were actually recreating a public health disaster. The Versailles model spread across European palaces, multiplying the horror and creating networks of royal cesspits that competed to see which could house more people in more unsanitary conditions. The psychological impact on Louis XIV himself must have been profound, though it's rarely discussed in historical accounts. He had created this environment as a monument to his own glory, but he had to live in it every day. He breathed the same toxic air, smelled the same overwhelming stench, and witnessed the same degradation as everyone else. His pursuit of absolute power had trapped him in a prison of human waste that he could never escape, because admitting the problem would undermine the very authority he was trying to establish. The end result was a complete disconnect between appearance and reality that characterized the entire ancient regime. Versailles looked magnificent in paintings and descriptions, but the lived experience was a daily nightmare of biological horror that slowly drove its inhabitants mad with the contradiction between what they were supposed to represent and what they actually lived through. This disconnect between royal mythology and royal reality ultimately contributed to the psychological foundations of the French Revolution, when common people finally understood that their supposedly superior rulers were actually living like animals in a golden cage made of their own waste. As we step back from these horrifying glimpses into the reality of royal life, one truth becomes undeniable. The fairy tale of clean, beautiful royalty is just that, a fairy tale constructed by people who never had to live the reality. These weren't stories about dirty people in pretty clothes. These were human beings trapped in biological nightmares of their own making, where vanity, tradition, and social pressure combined to create living conditions that would qualify as torture by any modern standard. The queens and noble ladies we've encountered weren't monsters. They were victims of systems that valued appearance over health, ceremony over comfort, and status over basic human dignity. They lived their entire lives in physical discomfort that would drive modern people to madness, yet they maintained composure, ruled nations, and shaped history, while literally crawling with parasites and slowly poisoning themselves with their own beauty routines. When you turn off this video and return to your clean modern life, remember these forgotten queens. Remember that beneath all the crowns and ceremony, these were just people trapped by accidents of birth and lives of unimaginable discomfort, trying to maintain humanity while their own bodies betrayed them day after day, year after year, until death finally released them from their gilded prisons of filth.